fair and justified to punish the citizens of a country for the actions of their governments? Well, it really depends on who you ask, but one thing that is for sure is that this kind of collective punishment is gonna happen way more often in the future. As a Russian who doesn't support the government, I've struggled with this question a lot myself, especially in the context of the sanctions against Russia, which were not only aimed at the Russian regime and the Russian economy, but also the Russian people themselves. And even though a lot of Westerners like to make the claim that the point of these sanctions on Russia is to try to make the Russian people rise up against the government and really feel the repercussions of Vladimir Putin is doing, and therefore to turn them against the government, I think it is actually having the opposite effects, and the West is about to once again repeat their mistake with the country of Georgia, which is a country in which the people have been heavily protesting against the government, but the protests did not succeed. And right now, the EU is planning to punish the Georgian people for the actions of their government and take away their right to visit Europe without a visa. And even though the situation is quite different, it does remind me a lot of what happened in Russia. Now, while I'm not trying to say that Russia should have faced zero repercussions, the Russian people right now largely feel like they're being punished by the West for the things that they had no say in and that they have zero control over. The sanctions and restrictions towards the Russian people apply to everyone. It doesn't matter if you support the war or not, what your opinion is, and if you've ever protested or spoke out against the government or not. You're still going to have issues with visas, banks, and so on. And even though I don't agree with the Russian government, I've talked about this stuff as well. For example, about Visa and MasterCard leaving Russia, where they made it so that Visas and MasterCards that were issued by Russian banks now could no longer work outside of Russia. So basically this was a measure that didn't affect the Russians who stayed in Russia in any way whatsoever because the cards continued working inside Russia. And the only people who this was a problem for were people who actively were trying to leave Russia. So the entire thing was just complete nonsense in my opinion. And the Russian government perfectly used all of this as propaganda, basically telling the Russian people, look, they really all hate us, they hate Russians, they hate everything we stand for, they hate everybody, even the liberals and the traitors of Russia who left Russia, even they're not accepted. You see, this is exactly why we have to stand with glorious leader Vladimir Putin. And as a result, a lot of Russians who maybe even before had pro-Western views and never really were fans of the government, these people become increasingly disappointed and resentful towards the West. And many of them basically become Putin supporters kind of out of spite. I'm not trying to defend these people and I do not agree with them, but if the goal of the sanctions is really to try to make the Russian people rise up against their own government, clearly it's not really working out. And well, right now, the European Union is planning to do the exact same thing to yet another country. If you follow my channel and my journey after I left Russia, you might know that I lived in the country of Georgia for 2 years. And right now, Georgia is going through a big political crisis. While the majority of the Georgian people are actually pro-Western that support the idea of the integration with the European Union, they don't really like Russia, which makes sense because Russia literally invaded Georgia in 2008. The Georgian government has actually been moving closer towards Russia and passing new laws that kinda destroy the possibility of European integration in Georgia. The Georgian people have protested against these laws and their governments in massive street demonstrations. And even though they were huge in scale, the ruling party still managed to stay in power and actually even won a recent election. Now, Georgian people actually have one luxury that other people from other post-Soviet countries like Russia or Armenia, for example, don't. They have the ability to travel to the European Union without needing a visa. And I was always really happy for my Georgian friends that they had this opportunity to kind of go out there and explore the world, even though it was way more difficult for me to get to these places with my passport. And well, right now the European Union is considering taking away the ability of Georgian citizens to visit the European Union without a visa before the end of this year. With the main reason being that the Georgian government is acting undemocratic and has not fulfilled the promises and passed the reforms needed to actually begin the process of the European integration. So, long story short, the people are about to be punished for the actions of their government that they don't like and that they actively protested against. Now, regular Georgians will not have the ability to visit Europe because of their government, while at the same time, the corrupt government's officials will continue to vacate and own expensive real estate in Europe. Sounds like justice to me, guys. And even though the situation is not quite the same, this actually reminds me a lot of what happened to the Russian people as well. Especially considering that recently a few very prominent sanctioned members of the Russian government visited Geneva, Switzerland for a conference, where the sanctions were lifted for the time of their visit and where they were given a platform to spread Russian propaganda in front of European officials. Meanwhile, the average Ivan has to suffer the consequences because he started the war, I guess. Once again, sounds like justice. So, hey there people, it is your boy Roman, your favorite neighborhood Russian, and welcome to a brand new video in which we'll talk about the topic of collective responsibility and if it's justified to punish a country's population for the actions of their governments. And I also want to talk about why, in my opinion, the EU is making a big mistake regarding Georgia, and why I think the decision to not let Georgians travel in Europe is only going to backfire and increase the Russian presence in the region. I'll try to very briefly explain what is going on in Georgia right now. In short, the current ruling party of Georgia, called Georgian Dream, has been actually running the country since 2012, and even though they've always advertised themselves as a pro-European party that is trying to bring Georgia to the European Georgian Dream, the truth is that the party has actually been drifting away from that direction and going more towards Russia, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. And despite the fact that the party still claims they're pro-European and they even got Georgia the candidate of joining EU status, the government has been passing extremely controversial laws. For example, the foreign agent law that is pretty much the exact copy of the Russian one, a law banning LGBT propaganda, which is also very similar to the one in Russia, plus several more laws aimed at restricting NGOs, media, and so on. The people of Georgia were not really happy about this, and massive protests took place all over the country, with the biggest ones of course taking place in Tbilisi, the capital city. These protests were absolutely wild and massive. There were a lot of crazy scenes and moments from these protests that, went viral on the internet and so on. There were protesters of all ages, but especially a lot of them were young people, because the young generation of Georgia is very pro-Western, and they definitely want to move towards that pro-European route. So yeah, the protests in Georgia went on for a long time. They even still continue to this day on a smaller scale. However, the truth is that the process just did not succeed. The people didn't really manage to affect the government and change the situation, because in the end the ruling party managed to pass all the laws that they wanted to pass and also even won the recent election. So as a result, a lot of people in Georgia are feeling pretty hopeless and powerless right now. They feel like their country is going in the wrong direction and they cannot affect it. And now, on top of all of this, the European Union decides to kick them when they're down and take away their ability to travel to Europe for essentially failing to overthrow their governments. Georgia's visa-free regime with the EU is currently at risk over backsliding concerns. The EU plans to reintroduce its visa regime with Georgia unless Tbilisi curbs democratic backsliding. The European Commission will notify the South Caucasus country of its decision by 31st of August. The European Commission is to send a letter to the executive in Tbilisi, suspending the visa liberalization regime in place since 2017 by 31st of August. The assault on democracy by Georgian Dream, the ruling party, is growing more severe, said EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaya Kallas. What can we do? This includes suspending the visa-free regime, the association agreement, and sanctions. Now, some people in the EU do have some compassion for Georgians. We think that restrictions should be put on those who are responsible for repression and not on the people of Georgia, said Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. But Kallas said the EU should be consistent with its political principles and needs. So far, we have got this position that we don't want to hurt Georgian people, and taking away the visa-free regime is really having an impact on them. But at the same time, it's also an issue of credibility of the EU, so she's basically saying, yes, we will hurt the Georgian people, like, we don't want to, but we will. And this right here is actually the letter that was sent. Georgia is breaching fundamental rights and freedoms. They request the Georgian authorities to repeal the law on transparency of foreign influence, or the foreign agent law, and the legislative package on family values and protection of minors, and to amend the National Strategy and Action Plan on Human Rights to ensure that the rights of LGBTIQ persons are fully upheld. So basically, as far as I understand, the EU is trying to give an ultimatum to the Georgian government here, saying, look, if you don't stop with these crazy laws that you're passing, we are going to take away the right of your people to visit us. And your people will get really mad at you and will ask you questions. But the issue is that I just don't think that this is how it works. I hope that at this point, a lot of us understand that protests do not always work, and they do not always end in the government being changed and the protesters winning. We've already had Hong Kong, we had Belarus, we had protests in Russia in 2011, and these recent Georgian protests now. I think they've shown us that things do not always play out perfectly in life. And not all demonstrations automatically end in the government being changed. And at this point, when I hear a person say stuff like, just overthrow the government, bro, or just overthrow Putin, bro, I already know that the person doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about, and they're basically living in like a Marvel slop cinematic universe for babies where the good guys always win. If the logic behind taking away visa-free travel for Georgians is the same as the logic behind sanctions for Russians, to make the people want to stand up to their governments and, in Georgia's case, for the people to make their government act more pro-European, I really do not think that we are at a point in time when that is a possibility anymore. A lot of people like to point to Ukraine as a successful example of a post-Soviet country that had protests where they actually overthrew the government. But Ukraine was more of an exception to the rule, where a big part of the establishment actually supported the protesters. So would the European Union also sanction Ukrainian people in case the protests failed and the government stayed in power? And it would also take their visa-free regime away? I mean, this is just a hypothetical, because Ukrainian citizens actually didn't have visa-free travel with the EU in 2013-2014, but you get what I mean, right? If anything, I think that this decision will actually backfire and only further Russian presence and Russian interests in the region. A lot of young Georgians who have always sided with the West, who protested against the government, and who wanted a European future for Georgia, a lot of these people are feeling very disappointed and even betrayed by the West. And even though I don't think that young people in Georgia will necessarily turn away from the West in massive amounts, they will definitely hold a grudge. And the Georgian government will use this as propaganda, by the way. They will tell the people that, look, this is exactly what we've been telling you. You cannot deal with these Westerners. You cannot get too close to them. They're gonna lie to you. They never keep their promises, and they even abandon those that support them. So stay with us, okay? And it is going to work in a big number of people, especially those who have already been skeptical towards the West in some regard. Which is also exactly what Russia is currently doing. They constantly talk about how the West cannot be trusted, how they hate all Russians, and how they sanctioned all of us regardless. So actually, guys, you should stick with us, with Vladimir Putin. We're actually the ones who are rooting for you guys. And a lot of people fall for this kind of rhetoric. They become more resentful, more bitter towards the West. And it's very possible that something like this might happen in Georgia. And also, traveling is one of the best ways to look at different parts of the world, get a new perspective, and also take a look at your own country from a different lens. Perhaps one of the reasons why the Georgian people, and especially the Georgian youth, really wanted to join Europe is because they had the opportunity to visit so many European countries without any hassle and issues. And when visiting those countries, they saw in those countries things that they liked, things that maybe their own country lacks, and things that could be improved upon. Things that Georgia could strive towards. However, if you cut all of this and introduce visa requirements, the amount of people who will get to travel to Europe from Georgia will massively decrease. And many people who used to visit Europe often will no longer have this opportunity. And while the European Union thinks that they can maybe scare the Georgian government with this kind of proposal, I think they're actually playing into exactly what the government wants. Because it is way easier to control a population that does not travel and see the world. You see, as a Russian, I've always thought that maybe if the Russian people got to travel around Europe a little more, or maybe just left the country more in general, Russia would be way different and way more normal. Because our people could actually see other countries, see how life can be better, and maybe even get inspired by other countries' achievements. However, since a lot of Russians are simply just too poor to travel, over 70% of the country has never been abroad. And when you have a population like that has never seen any kind of different life or society, it is very easy to control them, manipulate them, and feed them any narrative. Of course, these people will believe that everybody in the West is drowning in, LGBT Nazi debauchery, and that older people are just in ruins and in crime, that everybody in Europe is freezing without Russian gas, and that, everybody hates Russians. They will believe in it because they've never seen and probably will never see these places with their own eyes. So I feel like if the European Union wants to support the pro-Western, pro-European minded Georgian people, and also to make sure that the amount of these people grows in the country, the solution is definitely not restricting Georgian people from entering Europe as a punishment. Because the new order of things will only incentivize people to not be pro-European, to have zero connection to Europe. And this kind of isolation only lets Russia come in and have an even easier time spreading their propaganda and narratives inside Georgia. And also, if the European Union is really concerned with the situation regarding LGBT rights in Georgia and how the government has been cracking down on them, I really don't think that the solution is to cut off the access to Europe from people who might be under danger of persecution. Right now, as I'm recording this video, if you're a Georgian who's also LGBT, and if you're facing some sort of homophobic threats or persecution or stalking or danger, you can simply take a flight to Europe, be in safety, and then figure out a way, maybe even possibly apply for asylum. If the visa requirements get reintroduced though, you will be stuck in Georgia with no way out, facing potential risk. Now this right here totally sounds like something that is going to improve the life and the rights of LGBT people in Georgia, right? I mean, hey guys, what do I know? Now again, I'm not trying to say that the situation where the Russian citizens got sanctioned because of the war that was started by the government is the exact same as what could happen to Georgians, because contextually they're very different, but the logic that is applied here towards the Russian and the Georgian people by the West feels very similar. We don't care what you think, we don't care where you stand, and if you risk your freedom protesting against your governments, you will still suffer because of their actions. And it just really hurts, and it really sucks to see this stuff happening once again, especially to a country that I actually like and that I have a connection with and where I have friends and stuff. I just don't think that my Georgian friends deserve to have travel issues because of this. And again, another thing that needs to be pointed out here is the blatant hypocrisy and how unfairly all of this works. While the regular Georgian people will have to deal with new visa issues and fees, the government officials will be just fine. They already have tons of real estate in Europe, they have relatives living there and stuff, they're set. None of the higher-ups of the governments are gonna be having any issues with their lavish European vacations. Also, very similar to how things worked out with Russia as well. The peasants suffer while the rich and the powerful are barely affected. And now guys, apparently, even during the war with Ukraine, sanctioned Russian governmental officials get to visit Europe. On July 28, 2025, Valentina Matvienko, the spokesperson of the Federation Council of Russia, so literally one of the top officials in the entire country, the top-ranking female official in Russia, very closely related to Putin and his inner circle, she and her delegation from Russia attended the Inter-Parliamentary Union's 6th World Conference of Speaker of Parliaments and the 15th Summit of Women Speakers of Parliament. So basically, even if you have direct impact on the war in Ukraine, if you're a girl boss, it's fine. You can attend conferences in Europe. Part of the Russian delegation is under European Union and Swiss sanctions and actively supports Russia's war in Ukraine. Switzerland generally prohibits people subject to sanctions from entering or transiting through the country under its ordinance on measures related to the situation in Ukraine. However, the State Secretariat for Migration and the Foreign Ministry may grant exemptions, especially if the person in question is attending an international conference. So how very nice, guys. And also Valentina Matvienko was given a stage. She literally disseminated Russian propaganda talking points from it, and a lot of EU lawmakers and delegates even walked out during her speech. So I mean, what can I say, guys? It's just incredible, isn't it? It's just incredible how this stuff works. And I mean, look, I'm not exactly very surprised with the Swiss, because after all, they did love Nazi gold. But this kind of blatant hypocrisy in the big 2025 is actually insane. Once again, all Georgian citizens that protested against their government, everybody's guilty and everybody has to be punished. Average Russian citizen tries to apply for a visa, gets denied. And meanwhile, a Russian governmental official who is sanctioned by everybody and everything, a person who is literally in Putin's closest circle, gets to girl boss and visit a conference in Geneva because you see they just specifically lifted sanctions for her visit. Incredible justice and integrity right here, guys. What even is the point of the sanctions then? If Hitler gets to visit anyway. And a lot of people have also been pointing out that the way that Georgia is being treated right now is very hypocritical, especially if you take into account the situation in Serbia. Serbia is another non-EU country that is currently pretty friendly with Europe and that is also going through a political crisis. The Serbian people have been protesting against corruption in the government of Aleksandar Vučić for several months on end now. And the Serbian government has also been taking undemocratic measures and cutting down on freedom of speech and protest in the country, while Vučić still has a pretty firm grip on power. But unlike the situation in Georgia though, in this case the EU turns a blind eye. Despite the Serbian government acting undemocratic, the EU still continues to be friendly with Vučić and continuing talks about European integration, pretty much completely ignoring the Serbian people's struggle against the government. People usually connect this to the fact that the EU is really interested in mining in Serbia and the country's lithium reserves, which Vučić is really happy to provide. And apparently Serbia's prime minister is just too much of a valuable asset for Europe to lose, so he never gets called out for being anti-democratic. The EU's overall silence on the protests in Serbia and the lack of condemnation of Vučić has actually made a lot of young pro-European oriented Serbs really disappointed and also feel pretty much betrayed by the West. So, here we have a country that is also supposed to be pro-European and that is currently going through a bit of democratic backsliding, and the Serbs actually do also have visa-free travel with the European Union. So I guess logically right now, the European Union is supposed to take away the Serbian people's right to visit Europe without a visa, given that they're supposed to overthrow their leader and that, you know, they failed to do it or whatever, right? I mean, apparently this is how this works now. That's just the logic. And you guys gotta understand, I do not want the Serbian people to lose the right to travel to Europe. I don't want anybody's right to travel to be revoked, but like, do you now realize how stupid this truly is? And look, don't even get me started on Israel, okay? How is there a literal genocide going on right now? The prime minister of the country is literally wanted in The Hague for war crimes, and yet there are no sanctions or visa-free restrictions for Israeli citizens trying to go to Europe. If the logic is that the Russian people do not get the right to have fun and walk around in Europe while their country is literally dropping bombs on children, why do Israeli citizens get to have fun and vacate in Europe while their country is also dropping bombs on children? I mean, I guess the Israeli citizens are just simply not responsible for the actions of their governments. While every single Russian and Georgian person is responsible, by the way, and should suffer as a result of their government's actions. Okay, guys, sure. Make it make sense to me, please. At this point, these are not even double standards. These are like triple or quadruple standards, okay? So, in conclusion, is it really correct to punish the people of a country for the actions of their governments? I don't think so, but you know, there's a lot of opinions floating around, and once again, it just seems like this kind of collective responsibility, collective punishment thing is going to be the normal thing from now on. Of course, only applied selectively to some countries, you know, if there's nothing to gain from them. And you know, all this makes me really feel is that the world is just a really sad and unfair place. But either way, I felt like I had to talk about this. If you guys made it all the way to the end of this video, I hope you guys did enjoy it. If you guys did, then as always, please make sure to slap the like button on this video. And as always, if you guys would like to support me additionally, and that is financially, then go over to the link down in the description and buy me a coffee or become a YouTube channel member. It helps me out a lot. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'm gonna see you guys in the next one. Peace.